Welcome back to Gilmour Racing. I'm Matt, and on today's episode is the final race preparation of this car for the 2022 Australian Formula 3 Championship Series. This car's been driven by Noah Sands, has stitched up the championship for this year, and we're getting it ready for the last round at Phillip Island. So let's get into it. We're looking at the detail here for the aero components that's behind the front wheels. Now keep in mind, these front wheels run at say 100 degrees surface temperature and become really hot and really sticky and pick up everything off the track. So all the little stones and dust and everything that it runs over gets flicked off the tyre and basically sandblasted everything on this car. So you can see all the stone damage on these front barge boards here, on the smaller vanes here. And these have only just been repaired. They'd almost sandblasted all the way through at the Queensland round, and we haven't even had time to repaint them. The front edge of the floor has been damaged, and we'll need to repair that at the end of the season when this thing gets a big birthday. It'll come completely apart back to a tub, get fully stripped down, engine will get changed, we'll go all the way through the gearbox, and this will get a repaint because of all the stone damage. But we really need to pay close attention to the damage that it's causing to the surface area of the aerodynamic components, because if we lose that bottom edge, it will create an issue with the direction of the airflow under the floor, which is probably not so critical on a slower track, but we're off to Phillip Island. We need to make sure this thing is going to work how we want it to, and these little things will make a big difference on high speed. Generally speaking, every car we run will go through 2 sets of rims on a weekend. We'll have a set of practice tyres and then a set of qualifying and race tyres. So cleaning the rims has got to be done. They get filthy, and it's not just because they're white. They get a lot of brake dust on the inside, and that's thrown up directly from inside the rotor straight onto the rim itself. But these cracks, they have a service life and they do fatigue. Now the problem with that is these small spokes will get a crack in them. They'll fill full of brake dust, and between the heat cycles of the rim getting hot and cold, expanding and contracting, that crack will grow really fast. And we've had a rim failure where the centre has broken out of the rim and caused a whole heap of damage. So cleaning the rims, as much as it's not glamorous and it's not the best job around, it's got to be done. And the visual inspection that we do while we clean the rims is incredibly important. Now you might find this really surprising, but we don't change brake pads when they wear out. We change the brake pads every time this thing goes out for a race meeting. Now there's a lot of reasons for this. Sure, it's more expensive, but every time the driver hops in the car, he knows exactly what he's going to get. It's the same for every race meeting. The new pads work better. Not only that, the thicker the friction material on the brake pad, the more heat insulation it gives to the brake calipers. So we have zero brake caliper problems. We don't damage the pistons and the bores because the pistons are too far out. We don't have uneven wear on the brake discs or rotors. Everything works better with a new brake pad. So every time this thing goes to the track, it gets a brand new set of brake pads. Not a cheap way to go racing, but it's consistent and reliable. And when you're trying to win championships, that is the priority.
The underbody inspection is much like the rest of the inspection, just more, well, under the body. What we look for is missing bolts, damaged floor sections and damaged carbon work. And this time around, the front of the floor is quite badly damaged from the last round at Sydney, but it's still serviceable, so we'll leave it alone until the end of the season. Also quite a large crack in the rear diffuser. I'm not quite sure how it's happened, but it's certainly there. Once again, still serviceable, we'll leave it alone. It's got to come apart at the end of the year anyway. Other than that, there's nothing new, there's nothing we don't know about, but we'll keep looking and see what we can find.
A lot of attention goes into inspections. So all the panels come off the car so we can see exactly what's going on, and we can hopefully get on top of a problem before it becomes a major issue and might even cause us to not finish a race. And what we've found here is a broken exhaust. Now the exhaust on these don't just break, they're an Inconol exhaust, they're a really nice bit of gear. But what's happened is it's had a hit under the floor, it's actually broken the mounts, and it has allowed that to move around and crack this end tube here. And it's only because we had the covers off and we could see the soot from behind the cover that we knew we had something going on. So now we can pull that tube out individually, we'll get it repaired. Like I said, it's Inconol, it's quite nice to work with, but that crack has spread quite a long way, and I would be pretty confident that that's only happened in the last race, because we have the engine cover off between races and we would have seen that for sure. Also at the front of the car, the wing comes off, we've flipped it over, and a couple of the turning vanes have become damaged. Now the ripple strips are quite large at Sydney Motorsport Park, so if you're anywhere near them, you'll rip those off pretty much straight away. Remember, the front of the car is only about 20 millimeters high, so it's not going to take much at all to catch some of that carbon work and rip it off the car. Once again, that probably wouldn't make a big deal on a slower track, but we need to prepare this thing for Phillip Island. We need to make sure it is on point, and those turning vanes are hugely critical. We've tested a lot of variations of those, and we know they work and we know what they do, and we need to have them on the car. But before we get to the front of the car, we'll pull this exhaust off and get it ready for repair. Now there's no escaping the fact that the majority of the downforce on these cars comes from the floor and this massive rear diffuser. This is more efficient at making downforce than wings. Wings create a lot of drags, whereas the diffuser not so much. So the limited horsepower that these cars have got, they can use the ground effects really, really well. So part of the inspection is to make sure none of the turning vanes are broken, none of the lower edges are broken, and nothing is damaged. On the rear of the car here, you've probably seen me do the gearbox before, but we've got this rear nappy section. And it's called a nappy because everything ends up in there. This time it's full of rocks and rubber, but it's also part of the diffuser. It's got a little bit of floor section on there, which isn't too badly worn. It's got a few marks on it, but that's what it's there for. That's there to protect the carbon work from slapping on the ground. We need to make sure that this isn't damaged. Sometimes it'll tear the bolt holes out should it run over a curb or hit something it shouldn't. But that looks pretty good. Now we've got that nappy section off, we can get the back of the gearbox off, and we're going to inspect the gearbox. We also have to change gear ratios, and more than likely we'll change gear ratios a couple of times at the track. Phillip Island, being such a fast and flowing track, is really wind dependent, and if we've got a tailwind or a headwind, we'll need to go a ratio either way basically to get the RPM where we need it at the end of the straight. So it won't be the last time this comes apart for the year, and we'll more than likely have to do it at the track, but we need to make sure that this thing's spot on before we put it together. We'll check the dog rings, we'll check the input shaft, and we'll check the bearings. So we'll make sure there's no metal or contamination in the oil as well. But now we can get that rear hat off and have a look at the gears. The rear part of the gearbox is really easy to remove. All we've got is two wing stays that carry the weight of the floor to the rear wing, and basically they're ringer bolts, and this whole hat comes off, exposing the rear of the gearbox. Now, as soon as we pull this out, the gearbox all starts to come out, and you can probably see from there how clean it is. It's definitely well worth the effort to put a decent oil, and obviously we use KCK Lubricants and have done for many, many years. And it's massively reduced our maintenance costs. All the parts live a whole lot longer than any other team on the grid. And in saying that, we supply oil to a whole lot of other teams as well, not just in Formula 3. It's proven the gearboxes run cooler, quieter, and put more horsepower to the tyres. There's less lost in the drag of the gearbox itself. Generally, our gear sets and our dog rings will last 4 or 5 times longer than they would with the other oils that we've used previous to running KCK Lubricants, so that's a really important thing. But now we can get this rear section off, now that most of the oil's drained out. Comes off as a whole rear wing, the rear gearbox hat, and that exposes the full gear sets. Now we've been through this before, all the gears are changeable, but we're going to go a little bit more detail this time, and I'll explain what we do inside the gearbox, but not only that, what we use as a control system for the gearbox. Now with the back of the gearbox off, I was able to disassemble the gearbox, and I've laid it out on the bench in the order it's come out. So that's the top shaft, that's the bottom shaft in the order from the back of the case. And this is where the visual inspection is extremely critical. Now what we've already picked up is some damage to the retaining nut. Now the retaining nut locks the whole shaft together, and then it's got a collar over the back that stops that nut coming loose. Now if you have a missed shift, or even if you drop a wheel off the track, it might shock that top shaft enough to spin that top nut loose, and this will cause all sorts of issues. So that retaining lock for the nut itself cops a really hard time, and we've probably already put 4 in this car this season. It's something we change often. If it looks even a little bit sus, we get rid of it, because if that top nut comes off, that whole shaft comes apart, it'll blow that gearbox to absolute pieces. So we're going to need a new lock nut and a new lock nut collar, or the retainer. Now the back bearing has also started to spin on the shaft, something that we haven't seen this year, but it happens. We can just see where it's worked into the nut a little bit, and these will also have to be changed. That will never see a racetrack ever again. Now the gears themselves, they're a dog gear, so they cop a really hard time. They've got a limited number of collars to lock into, and that gear locks in positive. There's no synchros, it's just metal on metal, and it locks straight in. So if you miss a shift even the smallest amount, you begin to radius the corners on the dog to the point where it'll pop out of gear. So if there's any marks on these at all, it'll get new ones, and a lot of these are actually quite marked. It's you know, 2 or 3 missed shifts and that dog ring's not serviceable anymore. So once again, that'll never see a racetrack again. It's probably okay for some of the other teams, but we won't risk it. If the driver gets out there and has problems with keeping it in gear, well, that's on us. We should have replaced that. So we'll keep on top of it. We don't want to have any issues like this at the track. So a lot of these gears, 4th gear in particular, it'll probably never, it's now unserviceable. It's damaged that knob for the dog. It's rounded the edge to the point where we wouldn't use that again. That would never go back in a car. Another thing we can pull out is the bottom shaft comes out, and then the input shaft goes into this. So the input shaft goes all the way from this to the back of the engine. It's quite a long shaft, and we'll pull that out in a second and have a look at it. This, we check the splines for excessive wear. We also check the teeth to make sure the hard facing is not coming off. Generally not something we change track to track, but there is one track that we will. I'm not going to tell you which one because that's top secret, but still needs to be inspected. We need to know what we've got. The gearbox case itself looks really clean. There's no metal in there, no flaky bits, nothing we should really worry about. It's got a magnet in the bottom to catch anything. So if the crown wheel and pinion are starting to let go, we'll see that straight away in that magnet, and we know we've got to dig a little bit further. But a lot of these ratios will be changed anyway, but the dog rings will need to be changed as well. Now, shifter forks. Just a standard style shifter fork, nothing really fancy, but sometimes I'll lighten them and take that center bit out. And we've actually had these break before, which didn't end well. The gearbox ended up selecting 2 gears and basically ate everything inside it. So once again, these were new shifter forks at the start of the season, and we will monitor those to make sure they don't start to crack or wear too much. Now, when we talk about shift input, okay, we're talking about the driver actually shifts the gearbox. We don't run paddle shifts, and there's a couple of reasons for that, and I've offended a lot of drivers in saying so. We don't work with lazy drivers. Lazy drivers have paddle shift, but this is a category where you need to develop your driving skills. And something that's really important is learning how to shift gears, as basic as that sounds. The better you can shift, the more you'll understand the gearbox, but you'll also be able to diagnose issues quickly and be able to drive around them should you have an issue on the track. Once you understand what the gearbox requires to shift that, and those dog rings, as you've seen, you've got to shift them really positive. You've got to want that gear to go in. If you mess around or try to be nice to it, you'll rip those dogs straight off and you'll have no gears left. So you need to be positive, but you need to have a good feel, and that's really important for a young and up and coming driver to develop those skills and learn that ability. They'll also learn that when it grinds, when it pops out, what to do and how to work around it. And a lot of these skills they'll carry on to a paddle shift car naturally, and they'll also be able to give better feedback to the engineers on what the gearbox is doing should it have an issue, because they understand how it should work. So I've offended a lot of drivers in saying we don't do lazy drivers, but I think it's a necessary skill to learn. And at this point, the cars we're running against that do have paddle shift have had issues. And once again, if we're looking for a championship, we can't have issues. We can't have those little things go wrong. A misshift might cause an engine issue. We can't afford to risk it. So the gearbox selectors connected to the gear stick with a push-pull cable, you can feel exactly what their gearbox is doing. And it's critical, and the drivers learn a lot throughout the season, and we can tell a new driver that possibly isn't physically as strong as they could be, they'll wear dogs really bad, especially on a corner that's loaded up while they're changing gears. So we really drill the drivers about their fitness as well, but it helps the driver understand how to change gears, how to do it properly, and how the gearbox works. And this is something that they can carry on throughout their career, and I'm sure it will serve them well. There's another aspect to the gear changes that we haven't spoken about, and that's the ignition cut. You can't just jam it into gear while you're full throttle. You need to either lift off the accelerator or cut the ignition to get that thing to drop into gear. Now these cars run a Bosch system. It's a very nice ECU with a lot of tunability. Now what we can even control on the ignition cut on a gear shift is not only how long the ignition is cut for, but how slowly the engine power comes off and how quickly the engine power comes back on. Now this is a really cool car in the fact that we can do that. It's very tunable. So we can, once again, depending on how fit the driver is and how confident he is with the shift, is narrow that band right down and increase the ramp speed so we can get the power to come back on quicker to get him out of the corner. So when you listen to the shift from outside the car, it is almost seamless. Now, how we do this from factory is these paddles on the back. It's not paddle shift. One's for the radio, and there's another one on this side which is called flat shift. So what the driver needs to do is to load up the gear stick, and as he pulls that flat shift paddle, it drops into gear. And this is quite hard to do, very hard for a young driver to get his head around, and especially hard if you're on a high G corner where you're steering the car, shifting gears, and taking 2 fingers off the steering wheel to pull that paddle. So what we've done this year is incorporated a strain gauge into the shifter itself, which we can use with the factory Bosch system. Now this gives us untold benefits. We can still use the ramping of the Bosch system, which gives us those seamless gear changes. Driver can keep one hand fully on the steering wheel while shifting gears, and it's much more positive. If the driver leans on the shifter, it'll cut the ignition and he'll have a missed shift. But if he uses the shifter correctly, it's positive every time. Now this flat shift system and the strain gauge system only works at full throttle and will not work on the rev limiter. So on the starts, in particular, the driver will have to be aware that if he flares it up, spins the tyres through first, he will not be able to use the flat shift into second gear. He will need to lift and shift or give it some clutch. We much prefer lift and shift. We don't like using the clutch. It's a small clutch, as you've seen in previous videos, and they don't take much punishment. They get hot, they slip, and then they're done. So another aspect of the gear shift that we've come up with solutions for, it's actually a factory option for this car, but was never included in this car, so we've piggybacked into the factory system. And with our friends at Brook Motorsport, who was able to help us out with integrating the strain gauge into the shifter into this car, it's a faultless system. Even if the electronics break down, the driver can still shift the car manually. Not something you can do with a paddle shift. If you have a failure, you have no gears. But because we're mechanically linked to the gearbox through a cable, the driver can still select gears should he need to. After a really thorough inspection of the gearbox case, the shafts and everything else, the gearbox has gone back together. Now keep in mind we change all the ratios track to track. So it's got the full set of ratios in it to suit Phillip Island, and because of normal wear and tear, 3 of those pairs are brand new. We've also got some new dog rings in there, new locking nut, new locking collar. So this thing should be right to go. Now that we know everything's good, the rear hat and the wing assembly can go back on, and we can start putting the rear of the car back together. One of the things you've probably heard me mention when we change setup track to track is shock absorber adjustments. Now these are really simple to adjust. There's essentially two settings on them, bump and rebound. Now what that means is how the shock absorber behaves as the car either goes over a bump, or rebound is how fast the wheel will come back down to stay in contact with the ground. And assuming the rest of the car is pretty well balanced, we can fine tune the characteristics of the car with the shock absorbers alone. We can get the front to dip faster or slower, come up faster or slower, and vice versa at the back. We can get the rear to squat more to help with power down, or to ride a bump better. So depending on how many bumps are at the track, how bumpy the track is, and also how fast or slow it is. A slower track will need more assistance in getting the weight transfer, a faster track not so much. So by tuning these two little knobs, we can change the personality of the car and its handling characteristics quite a lot. Another maintenance job which gets taken care of round and round is the suspension arms. Not only a visual check, but these get quite damaged. We've talked about it with the aero blasting on the front panels, but everything behind the front wheels really gets hammered, and the leading edge of the suspension arm is no different. But what we do is we use duct tape to clean up that edge and put a protective layer on it to stop the stone chips, but also clean up the airflow. Keep in mind these two have the tether that goes all the way through the front of the arm, so it's actually got a carbon cover on it. So if we can clean up the airflow around that, it's going to make a little bit of difference. Keep in mind everything behind that is the rear wing, so if we've got any disturbance in this area, it will affect that lower plane on the rear wing. So it's really key to keep the airflow nice and clean. And little stuff like this, as much as it's not the most glamorous or inspiring job in the world, it's all these little things that add up to make the difference. For those of you who have been watching the previous videos will know that this thing here is the air intake and the air filter lives inside that. You'll also know that we service the air filter every race meeting. Because they do get damaged, we actually had a backfire at Queensland Raceway which melted the air filter out of the airbox as we were heading out for qualifying, so we had to change that in pit lane. But what we also service is, if I can get this off, is the fuel injectors themselves. The fuel injectors live inside the airbox here, the fuel rail, the wiring harness. Now we service this annually. We also pull this off periodically and clean it out. As much as it has the air filter inside it, it gets trapped full of absolutely everything. It is behind the front tyre, so anything that gets flicked up off the track will for sure end up in here. Now the fuel injectors, they become blocked. The worst thing we do for these cars is they get driven 2-3 days a month. The engines get switched off hot, they naturally attract condensation inside the air intake, and the race fuel and the moisture in the condensation causes corrosion, so the end of the injectors become blocked with corrosion. So we need to pull them out and get them serviced. We change the O-rings, we visually inspect everything. This surface here needs to be sealed. Should we get scrutineered, they will vacuum test the airbox to make sure we don't have any leaks, and if we have any leaks at all on this surface, we're out. So priority. Sometimes it'll become cracked just because of flex or because it's been damaged or had a hit. But most importantly, the injectors. Now we're going to do both airboxes at once. We do have a spare airbox should we ever need it. So we're going to pull all the injectors out, get them all serviced at once, and reassemble the two airboxes. But even with the air filter in place, the amount of gunk and garbage that gathers over the trumpets and around the fuel injectors is quite incredible. A lot of that is actually the air filter coming apart itself. It is a foam filter. They're not particularly efficient at straining out dirt, but they're very good at flowing air. So it's a compromise. So if we can keep this clean and neat and be on top of the maintenance, it will serve us well. Obviously, before we go racing, we at least need to check the coolant level in this thing. But how do you do it? Well, effectively, this is the radiator cap. It's cast into this whole top engine mount, which is also the cam box as well. It's a part of the engine. And keep in mind, the neater the packaging, the smaller the bodywork, the more aerodynamic it is. So this is really neat. The radiator cap just comes out, and we can look down the top of that to see where the water level's got to be, which is normally about the bottom of that mount there. That goes down into the engine. Now the radiator on either side, they've got their own bleed hole to bleed the air out of them once you change the engine or have a radiator out, you've got to spend quite a lot of time to get all the air out of the system. Otherwise it doesn't work at all. The engine gets hot and you'll be changing the engine again. But checking the coolant level, that's how we do it, that's where it is. Before we had the injectors serviced, we had them tested to see their flow rates. And there was probably 8% discrepancy across the 4 injectors that were in this car, and about the same in the spare set. So it was certainly worth getting them cleaned. If all these cylinders aren't working at 100%, we're giving away performance. So that's something we've had rectified. It's all gone back together pretty well. We do check for fuel leaks before the airbox goes on. If we've got an injector O-ring that's been pinched, it'll fill this airbox full of fuel, and that'll be the fire up you don't want to have. Everything else has gone together pretty well. Another new air filter, and this thing's sealed, ready to race. Part of the race prep for Phillip Island is also to do engine oil. So to do that, we need to start the engine. Being a dry sump setup where the tank's higher than the engine sump, all the oil will gravity feed into the engine, and if we go to drain the oil tank, there'll be nothing in there. So we start the engine up, pumps all the oil back into the oil tank, and then we can drain it from there. So the oil tank is in the center of the gearbox. We have covered that off a few times in previous videos. We use a vacuum pump just to pull the oil out. We've also got the catch can in the middle of the gearbox, and it's a good practice to drain that as well. If that gets a little bit too much oil in it, it bleeds out all over the back of the car and makes a huge mess, and often upsets the scrutineers and the officials. So we'll need to take care of that as well. Starting this thing up was also a good test to make sure the new injectors are okay, the gearbox is okay, there's no weird noises and there's no puddles on the ground. So everything else is looking pretty good. We'll keep getting this engine oil out. We'll fill it back up, and that's another job off the list. Now that the engine oil is drained out, filling the oil is basically tipping it back in the same hole. We know exactly what comes out, so we know exactly what to put back in. Now, what engine oil do we use? Do I really need to say it? KCK 10W40 full synthetic engine oil. This is also compatible for a lot of road cars, but it is extremely thermal stable. It puts up with the heat and the punishment a lot better than most of the products around there. It is Australian made, it's Australian owned, it's manufactured right here. Even the bottles come from Australia, everything is proper Australian made, but it's a world-class product. And we ship a lot of this around the country and around the world because it is so good. This is used in a whole lot of cars and a whole lot of race cars. I wish I could tell you what it was in, but I can't, but it's a far superior engine oil. And if you haven't tried it, you need to try it, and you should check out the website just so you can learn that little bit more about it. We rave about the stuff because it's so good. We don't wear parts out. Stuff in the engine reaches its service life before we wear it out. And there's not too many race engines that do that. It handles the race fuel. This has got the oxygenated ELF in it. There's no corrosion inside the engine, unlike some of the other oils. So it's definitely well worth checking out. Do your homework. You might just learn something. But KCK engine oil, one of those things you've got to use. Looking at the underside of the wing and the repairs we've got to do this round are actually quite straightforward. They're just these turning vanes, quite a nice bit of gear, but they just bolt on with 3 bolts. So not a big deal at all. I've just unbolted this one and replaced it, and we'll do the one next to it. This one's got a bit of damage on the front edge and a crack down the side, so we'll get rid of it. We'll have 2 new ones on the side of the wing. What we also have, and we can see here, is skid plates. These are the lowest part of the wing, and they drag on absolutely everything. They are a consumable. We do wear them out. They drag coming out of the pit garages, driving around the pits, on the racetrack, over curbs. And these are lower to protect these bits here because these do matter. These have a huge influence on the aerodynamics around the side pods in particular, and they have to be there. And the less damage and the longer we can make them live, the better the car will perform. But also some of the other details. In here is the mounting holes for this bottom wing element. We tape this up to clean up the airflow under the car. Some guys probably don't, and probably don't think it matters, but it does. You can actually buy Dallara part number stickers that go over those holes just to clean up the airflow. Now, all this stuff in behind the crash box here might look a little bit complex and a bit confusing, but it's not. It's really quite simple. 3 master cylinders, clutch, front and rear brake. So nothing uncommon there. The reservoirs are on top, and it's got a breather bottle just so it doesn't make a mess on the high G-force corners where it will overflow if these are a little bit full. These have got foam inside them to stop the brake fluid sloshing around. Also, not really uncommon. What we do have over this side though is 2 pressure sensors. We monitor the braking pressure, and it's hugely important, especially with developing the driver. How you use the brakes in these cars really determines how you activate the aero and the weight load. These cars don't have enough mass themselves to transfer the weight to the outside of the car or to the front of the car under braking or under cornering. So using the brakes to get the car to pitch hard and to get the front to squat to help you turn into a corner is really quite important. So using that as data for the driver development is critical. Now, we do bleed the brakes round to round. A lot of the guys we race against bleed it after every race, but since we've used the KCK .6 brake fluid, we probably don't even need to bleed it round to round. It's just something we do out of habit and just to make sure it's okay. We have no master cylinder issues, no brake caliper issues, we have no corrosion issues, and I can't believe everybody doesn't use that brake fluid. It really is the best. Now, braking performance on these cars, they're only small brakes, small brake pads, but we would expect to go from 230 kilometers an hour to 80 kilometers an hour in about 1.5 seconds, so they do pull up very effectively. But the majority of the braking is done at maximum speed. While you've got the downforce on, you cannot lock these brakes. You stand on that pedal as hard as you want and you will not lock these brakes. So the majority of the braking is done in that first phase, and then you roll off the brake as the aero comes off and then begin to turn into the corner. Once again, it's quite a process to keep the front of the car pitched, but one of those things we educate the drivers on, help them understand what they need the car to do and how they need to force the car to effectively do what it needs to do to get the best out of the car. But now we'll bleed the brakes, we'll bleed these pressure sensors, and that's another job off the list. Both the wings, front and rear, are heavily adjustable. Not only with the adjustment holes themselves, but we can also change elements. We've got low, medium and high downforce elements that we can use, and then use the holes within them to give us essentially infinite adjustment. And we've got a whole lot of theory and research that goes into where our wing settings will be for a particular weekend, and we will often tune them during the weekend themselves to keep up with the track conditions that will change every time we get out there. One of the governing factors on how much front wing we can run is how strong the driver actually is. We can rack a whole lot of front wing into this car, but the faster you go, the heavier the steering gets, to the point where the driver will really struggle to turn the steering. We don't run power steering, not in these cars. So the driver's fitness and strength, not only his core, but his arm and upper body strength, is hugely important in getting the most out of these cars. We've had conditions where we've needed to take wing off from what would be optimum just so the driver could steer it for 8 laps. Other than things like making sure all the tyres are at the same pressure, before we weigh this car, we also need to make sure we know how much fuel it's got in it. And we use this rig. It's got quick couples on either end. We can plug it straight into the car and drain the fuel out. Not only that, we can measure exactly how much fuel comes out of the car and therefore know exactly how much fuel to put back in the car. We can use this to calculate fuel burn per lap, fuel burn per kilometre. We can see this change during the day as the atmospheric conditions change. But not only that, because it's so accurate, should a driver need ballast, we can use this to determine how much extra fuel we'll put in the tank to meet ballast and get that driver to minimum weight. In preparation of getting these corner weights sorted, we obviously need to get this car on the scales, but it's a little bit more than that. We've actually got it marked out on the center of the floor here, and this is where we weigh all the cars. Formula Racing Academy has now joined us, and we actually weigh there's quite a few cars in here that we corner weight race to race. So it makes it easier. We can all use the same spot without getting in each other's way. So these pads are leveled. They're laser leveled. The cross weights, the pads themselves are leveled, but they've also level amongst themselves. So this is a dead level patch that we can sit the car on time and time again, and knowing that we'll get the same results every time. The scales then go on, the scales are then zeroed. To do this, we need to lift the car up. How do we lift the car up? That's what the roll hoop's for. The roll hoop is pretty well the exact center of gravity of this car. It's balanced really well. It just sits there and floats around. The roll hoop is also the tow point. If you ever see one of these cars flat towed around the track, they'll throw a strap around the roll hoop and then pull the car that way. So one of the strongest parts of the car obviously being the roll hoop, but it also serves a lot of functions. Now that we've got all the scales are level, set up correctly and zeroed, we can now lower the car onto the scales and we can start to get some weight readings. Now that we've got the car sitting on the scales, we can see exactly where the weights are at, and we can tell the rear left, front right are both heavy. So we've got diagonal jacking. It's heavy on one of those corners, forcing the other tyre into the track. We need to get this thing balanced. It needs to be pretty well perfect across the front, and we know by the total weights that we can get there. So what we're going to do is make an adjustment at the back, see if we can correct that heavy tyre at the back on the left, which should even up the front naturally. By simply adjusting the push rod on the rear right-hand corner, we're able to tune out that little bit of weight difference we had across the front, and the rear of the car's pretty well perfect as well, and that's sort of where we would expect this car to be. Total weight for this thing, dressed, wet, it's got fuel in it, oil in it, all ready to go, 478 kilos. So it's a very, very light race car, and this is one of the reasons why they're so fast. It's very quick to change directions, very quick to accelerate and stop. The race weight is capped. We do have a minimum weight we must meet, and some of the cars we run lead and ballast, as we've touched on before. But that's it for this episode. The Dallara is done and it's good for Phillip Island. It's ready to go. We'll get Noah in this thing and we'll see how he goes around there. But thanks again for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Stay tuned for the next video when we race prep the Mygale for Trent Grubel to drive at Phillip Island for the last round of the Australian Formula 3 Championship.